Hello, I'm Pastor Steve Crittenden of Epiphany of Christ Lutheran Church in Apache Junction, Arizona. Welcome to our Bible study. We're continuing this conversation that we've been having for a little while about kingdom. And we remember that the people of God had requested a king from God, and God said, God's response to them was, I'll be your king. You don't need to have a king. I'll be your king. And the people rejected that idea. They did not want God to be their king. They wanted a king like other peoples in the world had a king. And we've seen that didn't really work out very well for the people of God. But what we want to look at today is the covenant that God made with the second king that the people had. Saul was the first king. Things didn't work out very well under Saul's reign, and then David replaced him. And we want to look at what is called the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David. And when we think of covenants, we sometimes reduce a covenant to a contract. We can understand how contracts work. Party A makes a promise, party B makes a promise. If people don't follow through with their promise, this is going to be the result of it. Some of the covenants that we see between God and God's people do have that form of almost a contract, but most of the time, it's a different type of a contract. It's a contract, these covenants, between unequal parties. It's a contract where the party that has all of the power in the relationship says, because of the nature of me, because of my character, I'm going to make this covenant with you, which is really promises that are going to be made. So the covenant with David are promises that God is making to David, promises God doesn't have to make, promises that David didn't earn in any way, but what they are is they are promises that are made. They are blessings that reflect God's character. And where we find the covenant with David spelled out is in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel. And so I'm going to read for you from 2 Samuel. This is in the 7th chapter, beginning about verse 11. And this is God speaking through the prophet Nathan and speaking these words of blessing, these promises, this covenant with David. The Lord declares to you, this is Nathan talking to David, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. Now, there's great irony in this, but when we think of house, think of a royal house. Think of, for example, in Great Britain, the House of Windsor or the House of Stuart. It's the royal lineage of the family. And God is promising here that God is going to make a house. This, after the great irony in this is that David has asked God, David has said to God, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a temple. And God says, you're going to build me a house? And here, God says in this covenant with David that the Lord declares that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will rise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, but with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This is the covenant that God is making with David. And we see that this covenant, this relationship, this special promise of blessings that that God has made with David is a very special covenant for the people of God. Because one of the things that they see, they suffer, that David is this king that God is making this covenant with. Solomon is his son. And what, of course, we see is that Solomon is the end of that line, that the United Kingdom ends with Solomon. And after Solomon, the northern kingdom splits off, the northern kingdom of Israel splits off, and they have their own kings, and the southern kingdom of Judah has its own kings. And the people long for this blessing that God promises. And so we see, for example, that longing, that specialness that comes with this Davidic covenant being expressed in Psalms. For example, in the 78th Psalm, this is beginning at verse 67. This is the end of the Psalm. And what the psalmist is talking about here is that God didn't choose as a king somebody from the north, somebody from one of the other tribes, but chose as a king somebody from the tribe of Judah. This is verse 67. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the highest heavens, like the earth, which he had founded forever. He chose his servant David and took him from the sheepfolds, from tending the nursing ewes he brought to him, to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he tended them and guided them with skillful hands. This is talking about the king as a shepherd. That's that language that we see, that royal language of the shepherd. And we also see this in Psalm 89. I want you to listen to really the first 5 verses of the 89th Psalm. And this is speaking again to this covenant that was made with God. I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations. I declare that your steadfast love is established forever. Your faithfulness is as firm as the heavens. You said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to my servant David, I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. This is coming in the 89th Psalm, Psalm 89, at the very beginning of this. And this is just so important to the people because during the time of exile, they felt like somehow this promise that was made to David had been broken, that God wasn't keeping this promise. In fact, they thought that before the time of exile. They recognized that there were 2 kingdoms and they were in civil war with one another, and that there were people reigning who were not descendants of David. And this concerned the people. They wondered, what about this covenant with David that God had made? These were promises God made, and it appears that God isn't keeping those promises. That's what steadfastness means. Steadfastness means that God keeps promises, and that's one of the very early confessions about God. One of the very early understandings that people have about God is that God makes promises and keeps those promises, and it doesn't look like, with regard to the monarchy, with regard to this covenant with David, it doesn't look like God is keeping that promise. But as we look at the promise, I want to look very quickly at the individual blessings that make up this promise. And so we go back to 2 Samuel 7, and I want you to listen to, see if you can recognize where we see the various blessings, promises that God is making. First, at verse 12, When your days are fulfilled and you lay down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. This is the promise of a dynasty. God here in verse 12 is promising David a dynasty. Not only is David going to reign, but there's going to be a dynasty. David's descendants are going to reign. At verse 13, listen to the blessing that's in this verse. He, meaning the descendant, shall build a house for my name. This is what David has been wanting. David wanted to build a temple, a house for God. God said, no, I'm going to build a house of you. But your son is going to, your dynasty is going to build a house for me, is going to build the temple for me. And God promises David that God will have a special relationship with this dynasty, that this son, this offspring that God speaks about at verse 12 is not only David's son, but is going to be God's son as well. Listen to what we hear at verse 14. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. That's the promise that God is making to David, is that that dynasty that's going to be established is going to be an intimate relationship between God and the monarch of that dynasty. Even though we're told the son is going to do things wrong, even though, and this shouldn't be looked at as strictly talking about Solomon, but those in David's royal lineage, when they make mistakes, God is going to punish them for those mistakes. And in fact, the way God is going to punish them is God is going to use other people to do that punishment. I will punish him with blows inflicted by human beings, God says. But here's the blessing, here's the promise that's being made. But I will not take my steadfast love from him. So this loving relationship between God and the king, the dynasty, can never be broken. That's a promise that God is making. That's one of the blessings that we see described as part of this covenant. And the last one that's so important and we need to talk about is the blessing, the promise that's made in this covenant, that this kingdom is going to last forever. It will be without end. At verse 16, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. And that's such a wonderful, wonderful blessing. That's such a wonderful thing for David to hear, that his dynasty, this kingdom that he is, this royal lineage and dynasty that he's going to have, is going to last forever. Now, with covenants, there's always with the covenant some sign of the covenant. The sign of the covenant that God made with Noah is the rainbow. And the sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham is circumcision. So what is the sign of the covenant that God is making here with David? The sign of the covenant is the keeping of these promises. And so he established promises to establish the house of David, and that establishment happens. There is a dynasty because David's son is going to reign as king. God makes the promise that his son is going to build the temple, and that happens. Solomon does build the temple. There's a promise of this special relationship. There's a promise of things lasting forever and not being cut off. These, of course, are promises that look very far into the future. But since these other promises has been kept, there's no reason to believe that these promises won't be kept. That's why it's so important. You guys hear me talk so often about the promises that God has made. And what we see is that every time God makes promises, God keeps those promises. And since God made the promise of a dynasty and kept it, God made the promise that David's son would build a temple, and that promise was kept. There's no reason not to believe that all of these promises aren't going to be kept, including the promise that the kingdom is going to last forever. And yet it looked in the history of God's people like that promise was not going to be kept. It looked like that in fact God was going to break that promise. And it particularly looked that way during the time of the exile. This is why the time of conflict before the exile and the time of the exile these are such important times during the life of God's people, because it appeared to them that God was not keeping promises, that God's steadfast love was in fact being withdrawn. And that's the reason why this time period, this time right before the exile, the time of the exile, and the time after the exile, that's why we see the prophets being so active at that time. Because the people need to hear people speaking for God, telling them that it may look to you like you have been abandoned by God, but you haven't been abandoned by God. And so prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Micah, and other prophets are speaking to God's people to let them know, remember, God promised steadfast love. God promised a kingdom of David's that lasts forever, and God keeps those promises. It looked for a minute, a couple of hundred years before Jesus, that promise was going to be kept in the line of some people called the Maccabees. But of course, it didn't work out that way. They were defeated by empires that had come about. And yet there was this expectation of a Messiah. During the time between the Testaments, there was an expectation among God's people that God was going to fulfill this promise of the covenant with David, and would be anointing a Messiah. And one of the things that was part of that expectation was, of course, that this Messiah, this new leader, this new king who would be lifted up, would have to be a descendant of David, because this new Messiah would have to fulfill the covenant that God had made with David. And that's the reason why, as we look at the Gospels, Mark's was the first gospel that was written, and Mark was used by both Luke and by Matthew as those two writers put the story of Jesus together, and for their own particular audiences. But there's a reason, even though Mark was written first, that Matthew comes first. And the reason is that Matthew chose in his gospel to begin with a genealogy of Jesus. And so the New Testament begins at Matthew 1, a genealogy that shows that Jesus Christ descends from David. This is extremely important in order to point to Jesus being the Messiah. In order for Jesus to be the Messiah, Jesus must descend from David, because the Messiah must be the fulfillment of this covenant that God had made with David. And so we read the very beginning words of Matthew's gospel, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. That's the reason why Matthew's is the first gospel, because Matthew's genealogy establishes Jesus as a descendant of David, as being in the lineage, being part of the house of David. And then Matthew goes on in chapter 2 with the very familiar story of the wise men. And I want you to listen in this context of this story of the wise men. This is Matthew 2, beginning at the first verse. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, right, remember what we just read in the gospel, in the Psalms about David's birth. But here it is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the city of David. That's where David was born. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, and then listen to this question, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? Now, one of the things we have to make note of here is that the word that's translated Jews here in the original Greek actually isn't Jews, it's Judea. It's talking less about the ethnic group and more about the geographic province of the Roman Empire called Judea. That's what the Greek says here. But these wise men are asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at the rising and have come to pay him homage. These are royal visitors who have come to pay homage to the birth of a new king. Verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to be shepherd of my people Israel. Notice the echo that we have here of this Messiah being a shepherd. And of course, we hear Jesus use that language, the good shepherd language, and so on. This prophet that the religious leaders are quoting, this is the prophet Micah. And they are quoting, they're actually misquoting Micah here in a couple of different ways. They're misquoting Micah, and I'm going to read for you what is written in Micah, and I want you to see if you recognize a difference here. This is the 5th chapter of Micah, beginning at verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule over Israel. Notice the difference that happens here. Something is happening where they're trying to lift up this little town of Bethlehem. As it says in Matthew, and you, Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. And so what we have is that the religious leaders who are talking to Judah, are talking to Herod, are saying that the prophet said that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem of Judah, who is by no means the least, and yet Micah says, you are one of the little clans of Judah. Furthermore, that the rest of that quote doesn't actually come from Micah, but it actually comes back at 2 Samuel. This is the 5th chapter of 2 Samuel, and I want you to listen to the 2nd verse. For some time while Saul was king over us, it was you, talking about David, who led out Israel to be brought in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be ruler over Israel. This is God speaking to David. This is 2 Samuel 5 at verse 2, and that we have that shepherd language. So in Matthew, whether it's Matthew that's misquoting Micah and putting it together with 2 Samuel, I don't know, or whether it's these religious leaders. But from you shall come a ruler who is my shepherd, is to shepherd my people Israel. But what we see here is the expectation that the Messiah being born in Bethlehem is going to be the shepherd. That's the language that would invoke David's memory. And so this new king is going to come from David's house, from the line of David, and is going to be the shepherd. And we see, of course, so much in the Gospels that points to Jesus being this person. I want to also raise up to you the Gospel of Luke. This is in the 1st chapter. And this is really more of the same. This is when Mary is being told about the birth of Jesus, the birth of the new king. This is the 1st chapter of Luke at verse 26. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth. All right, this is where at this time Mary and Joseph are in Nazareth. That's also to fulfill one of the prophecies that the king, the Messiah, will be a Nazarene. And in fact, Jesus is a Nazarene who's born in Bethlehem. And we see that both of those prophecies come true. In the 6th month, the angel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth to a virgin engaged to a man named Joseph of the house of David, establishing that lineal relationship. The virgin's name was Mary, and he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High." He will be called God's Son. That's part of the covenant, in the covenant with David. Remember, God promised the blessing to David that David's son would also be God's son. And again, not speaking strictly about Solomon in that case, speaking about the sons that would follow David. And here we hear at verse 32, "He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." So here in Luke's gospel, we hear this connection with the covenant that's made to David, the covenant that we read about in the Old Testament in 2 Samuel, this promise that God makes, that David's throne, David's house will last forever, that David will not only be the king, but David will be the first of a dynasty, and a dynasty that's going to last forever. And the claims in the New Testament, in Matthew here and in Luke that we've looked at, point to Jesus being that new king. So Jesus is that new king. We've really established that. But now what we want to see is that some of what Jesus will do in his ministry, is that Jesus is going to work to convince people that he is that Messiah, that he is the descendant of David who is to be the king, the new king, not just of Judea, but the king, of course, of all the world. And the more important work that Jesus is doing is describing what that kingdom is going to look like and how different that kingdom is than the kingdoms that the people of God experienced before the exile, the kingdoms that actually put together the conditions that created the exile. First of the northern kingdom of Israel being taken away by the Assyrians, then the southern kingdom of Judah being taken away by the Babylonians. What we see is that happened because of the poor kings that the people had. But Jesus is a new king, not reestablishing, but fulfilling the covenant that God had made with David. And we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus's description of what that new kingdom is. We're going to do that next week, and I sure hope that you'll join us for that. Now, God bless you.